Mason's 3 years of silence shattered when the small orphan girl described his murdered daughter's hidden birthmark with chilling accuracy. Her impossible knowledge forced him to confront the powerful men who had destroyed his family and face the terrifying truth of why this child spoke with his dead daughter's voice. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The mountain pass stretched before him like a winding snake, bathed in the golden glow of sunset. Mason Blackwood rode his dun stallion at an unhurried pace, each hooffall echoing his own heartbeat, steady, measured, alone. His weathered face remained half hidden beneath the wide brim of his hat, deep lines carved by years of solitude and hardship. The thin mountain air carried the scent of pine and distant rain. Mason hadn't spoken a word in nearly 3 years, not since that night. Not since the flames. His voice had died along with everything else he'd ever loved. His eyes narrowed as he spotted movement ahead, a wagon struggling up the steep incline, its wooden wheels spinning against loose gravel. The driver, a thin man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, urged the horses forward with increasing desperation. The wagon swayed dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. Mason nudged his horse forward. He didn't seek company, but he wouldn't ride past folks in trouble either. As he drew closer, he noticed small faces peering over the sides of the wagon, children's faces, wide-eyed and frightened, at least 5 of them, maybe more. The driver spotted him and waved frantically. "Sir, please, could you lend assistance? We've lost our way, and this pass is treacherous." Mason offered a curt nod. He dismounted, his boots landing silently on the dusty path. With practiced movements, he approached the straining horses and examined the wagon's position. The back wheel had caught in a rut, and the axle looked close to breaking. One strong push might free it, but if done wrong, the whole wagon could tip over the edge. "Udi, are you heading to Silver Pine?" the driver asked, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "I'm Reverend Thomas Holloway. These children are bound for the orphanage there. Their previous home in Millbrook burned down last month." Mason stiffened at the mention of fire. His hands curled into fists at his sides, then relaxed deliberately. He nodded again and motioned for the Reverend to take the reins, while he positioned himself at the back of the wagon. 5 small faces watched him intently, 3 boys and 2 girls. None older than 10. Their clothes were worn but clean, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. One girl, smaller than the rest, with honey-colored braids and eyes that seemed too knowing for her years, leaned forward. "He doesn't talk," she said matter-of-factly, "but he's going to help us." The Reverend turned in surprise. "Emma, don't be impolite. I'm sure the gentleman has his reasons for being quiet." Mason met the little girl's gaze. Something about her steady eyes unsettled him, like she could see straight through the walls he'd built around himself. He broke the contact and focused on the task at hand, bracing his shoulder against the wagon. "When I give the signal," the Reverend called, "please push with all your might while I urge the horses forward." Mason nodded. The children gripped the sides of the wagon, their knuckles white. The little girl, Emma, never took her eyes off him. "Now!" shouted the Reverend. Mason pushed, muscles straining against the weight. The wagon creaked and groaned, the wheels spinning in empty air before finding purchase. With a lurch, it broke free. The Reverend's relieved laugh echoed across the mountainside. "Thank you, sir. The Lord sent you to us at precisely the right moment." Mason straightened, dusting off his hands. He turned to leave, to mount his horse and continue on his solitary way, but a small voice stopped him. "Mr. Emma had climbed down from the wagon and stood barely reaching his waist. "You're sad inside, I can tell. My mama used to say that helping others is the best medicine for a sad heart." Mason froze. The other children watched wide-eyed, and the Reverend seemed about to intervene. But the little girl wasn't finished. "We lost our families too," she said simply, extending her small hand toward his. "Maybe we could help each other not be sad." Mason stared at the outstretched hand. Images flashed through his mind. Another small hand, blackened and still among smoking ruins. His daughter, his wife, his home, all gone in a single night of senseless violence. The weight of silence pressed down on him. The words he'd sealed away scratching at his throat like trapped birds. The wagon creaked as the other children shifted. The Reverend cleared his throat awkwardly. "Emma, come back to the wagon, please. We've taken enough of this kind man's time." But Emma didn't move. Her hand remained extended, unwavering. "Aye, sometimes," she whispered. "The bravest thing is to not be alone anymore." Mason felt something crack inside him, a hairline fracture in the ice that had encased his heart for 3 long years. Before he could think better of it, he reached out and engulfed her tiny hand in his calloused palm. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first in 1,000 days. "The path ahead is dangerous," the Reverend said, adjusting his spectacles. "Bandits have been known to trouble these parts. Would you, perhaps, consider riding alongside us until we reach Silverpine? We'd be most grateful." Mason should refuse. He should reclaim his solitude, continue his aimless wandering. That was the safer choice. But Emma's hand was warm in his, and her words echoed in his mind. "The bravest thing is to not be alone anymore." He gave a single, decisive nod. Relief washed over the Reverend's face. "Wonderful. Children, make room. Our guardian angel will accompany us to town." Mason helped Emma back into the wagon. As he turned to retrieve his horse, she called after him. "I knew you would say yes," she said, her face solemn. "Well, not say it, but I knew you would help us." The other children watched him with new interest as he mounted his stallion and positioned himself alongside the wagon. The Reverend clicked his tongue, and the horses started forward once more. As they traveled, Mason became aware of 5 pairs of eyes studying him from the wagon. Emma's penetrating gaze, a freckle-faced boy with a missing front tooth, twin girls with identical dark braids, a lanky boy clutching a tattered book. "I'm Henry," the freckled boy finally announced, breaking the silence. "That's William with the book. The twins are Sarah and Rebecca." Mason nodded in acknowledgement. "Were you in the war, mister?" William asked, peering over his book. Mason shook his head. "Are you a real cowboy?" Henry pressed, a shrug this time. "Do you have a name?" Emma asked quietly. Mason hesitated, then raised his hand to his chest and made a deliberate motion. "Mason," Emma translated confidently. "His name is Mason." The Reverend glanced back in surprise. "You understand him, Emma?" "Not exactly," the girl replied, "but it seemed right." It was right. Mason felt a twinge of surprise that she had guessed correctly. There was something uncanny about this child, something that reached past his defenses. As the wagon rounded a bend, Mason raised his hand sharply. The Reverend pulled the horses to a stop. "What is it?" he whispered. Mason pointed silently ahead, where the path narrowed between 2 rock faces, a perfect spot for an ambush. His hand moved to the revolver at his hip, and he motioned for the Reverend to stay with the children. Then he nudged his horse forward, every sense alert. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. The children held their breath. Even the mountain breeze seemed to pause. Mason disappeared around the bend. Long moments passed. "Should we turn back?" the Reverend murmured, gripping the reins tightly. Emma shook her head. "He'll come back. He promised." "He didn't say anything of the sort," Henry objected. "Not with words," Emma replied softly, "but he promised all the same." Just then, Mason reappeared, his expression grim. He gestured urgently for the wagon to turn around. "Bandits?" the Reverend asked, his voice trembling. Mason nodded once. He held up 3 fingers. "3 men," Emma translated, her small face serious, "armed and waiting." The sun was sinking fast behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purple. Soon darkness would cloak the pass, making travel even more treacherous. But going forward meant certain danger. Mason's mind raced. He knew these mountains. There was another way to Silverpine. Longer, less traveled, but possibly safer. He could guide them, see these children to safety. He gestured to the Reverend, pointing to a narrow trail branching eastward. "Another route," the Reverend guessed. But night is falling. Mason's eyes met Emma's. In that moment, something passed between them, an understanding deeper than words. She nodded slightly, as if confirming a decision he'd already made. "We should trust him," she said firmly. "Mason knows the way." Mason led the wagon down the narrow trail as twilight deepened into night. The path wound through dense pine forest, occasionally opening to reveal the valley below, now shrouded in shadow. He rode slightly ahead, every sense alert for danger. Behind him, the wagon creaked and swayed, the Reverend doing his best to keep the tired horses steady on the unfamiliar route. "Oh, how much farther?" Reverend Holloway called, his voice tight with worry. "The children need rest." Mason held up 2 fingers, then pointed to the horizon. 2 hours, Emma translated from her perch at the front of the wagon. "We'll need to make camp soon." Mason nodded, impressed again by her intuition. She seemed to read his gestures with uncanny accuracy, as if they'd developed their own language in the span of an afternoon. Half an hour later, they reached a small clearing nestled against a cliff face, a natural shelter from the wind, with a stream bubbling nearby. Mason dismounted and motioned for the wagon to stop. "We're making camp here?" the Reverend asked, relief evident in his voice. When Mason nodded, the man sighed gratefully. "Thank the Lord, these little ones need sleep." The children tumbled from the wagon, stiff from the long journey. William immediately collected fallen branches for a fire, while the twins filled canteens at the stream. Henry helped the Reverend unhitch the horses. Only Emma stood still, watching Mason with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. "You've camped here before," she said. It wasn't a question. Mason paused in unpacking his saddlebags. After a moment, he nodded once. "With your family," his hands stilled completely. The night seemed suddenly colder, darker. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Emma stepped closer. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to make you sad again." Mason shook his head dismissively and returned to his task, but his movements had lost their fluid grace. Emma didn't press further, but she stayed beside him, helping unroll his bedroll and arrange stones for the fire ring. Soon flames crackled cheerfully, pushing back the darkness. The Reverend distributed bread and dried apples from their provision. Mason contributed jerky from his own supplies. The children ate hungrily, their faces golden in the firelight. "Perhaps we should introduce ourselves properly," Reverend Holloway suggested, adjusting his spectacles. "I'm taking these children to the Silverpine Orphanage, where Sister Margaret will care for them until suitable homes can be found." "I don't want a new home," Henry muttered, poking the fire with a stick. "I want my old one back," the Reverend sighed. "I know, Henry, but God has a plan for each of you." "Why did God's plan include burning down our orphanage?" William asked, his voice sharp despite his young age. "And before that, taking our parents." An uncomfortable silence fell. The twins huddled closer together, and Emma stared into the fire, her small face solemn. "Faith is tested in hardship," the Reverend began, but William turned away, opening his tattered book to avoid further conversation. Mason studied the children's faces, recognizing the grief etched there, the same grief he carried within himself. He understood William's anger better than the Reverend's platitudes. Sometimes there were no answers, no grand plan to explain away the pain. Sometimes things just burned, and you were left to make sense of the ashes. "What happened to your family, Mason?" Emma asked suddenly, her voice cutting through his thoughts. The Reverend inhaled sharply. "Emma, that's terribly forward." But Mason met the girl's gaze across the fire. There was no childish curiosity there, only a deep understanding that belied her years. Slowly, deliberately, he reached inside his shirt and pulled out a locket on a leather cord. He clicked it open and passed it to Emma. Inside was a small portrait of a woman with laughing eyes and a little girl about Emma's age. Both had Mason's strong jawline. "Your wife and daughter," Emma said softly, tracing the faces with her fingertip. "They're gone now," Mason nodded, something cracking inside his chest. The other children crowded around to see. What were their names? Sarah, one of the twins, asked. Mason reached for a stick and smoothed a patch of dirt beside the fire. With careful strokes, he wrote, "Elizabeth and Grace, Elizabeth and Grace." Henry read aloud. "Pretty names. What happened to them?" William asked, his earlier defiance softened by curiosity. Mason hesitated. He could feel the weight of their expectant gazes. He hadn't told this story to anyone, hadn't spoken a word since that night. But these children had lost everything too. Perhaps they, of all people, would understand. He picked up the stick again and wrote in the dirt, "Raiders. Like the men waiting to ambush us." Rebecca gasped. Mason nodded grimly. "Is that why you don't talk anymore?" Emma asked gently. "But because of what happened to them." He met her eyes and gave a single, sharp nod. The admission hung in the air between them, the most he'd shared with anyone in 3 years. The Reverend cleared his throat. clearly uncomfortable. "Children, perhaps we shouldn't pry into Mr. Blackwood's personal tragedy." "It's not prying," Emma insisted. "He wants to tell us. Don't you, Mason?" Did he? Mason wasn't sure. The words had been locked inside him for so long, calcified by grief and guilt. But something about these orphaned children, especially this solemn-eyed little girl, made him want to try. He wrote again, 3 years ago. Then he stared at the words, unsure how to continue. How could he explain the horror of that night, the smoke choking his lungs as he raced home from town, the barn already engulfed in flames, the sickening realization that he was too late, the still forms of his wife and daughter found huddled together in the root cellar where they'd tried to hide. Emma's small hand touched his, interrupting his dark memories. "You don't have to tell us everything," she said softly. "Just enough so you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Mason looked at her in wonder. How could one so young be so wise? "And I lost my mama in a fire too," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I remember how the smoke smelled, how hot it was, how she pushed me out the window but couldn't follow." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Sometimes I dream she made it out too." Mason's throat tightened. Without thinking, he reached out and placed his hand gently on her head, a gesture of comfort he'd once used with grace. Was it raiders, like the ones ahead?" William asked. His earlier anger transformed into solemn curiosity. Mason nodded. "The Blackwood raid." The Reverend breathed suddenly, recognition dawning on his face. 3 years ago, just south of Silver Pine. I heard about it when I first came to these parts. They said no one survived." Mason's jaw tightened. He wrote again, "I wasn't there, came too late." Understanding washed over the Reverend's face. "You blame yourself," he said quietly. Mason didn't respond. He didn't need to. The guilt was etched into every line of his face. "Is that why you're helping us?" Henry asked. "To make up for not saving them?" "Henry!" the Reverend scolded, but Mason just stared into the fire, the boy's innocent question striking closer to the truth than he cared to admit. Was that why he'd agreed to guide these children? Some misguided attempt at redemption? "I think," Emma said carefully, "that sometimes people are brought together because they need each other. Maybe we need Mason's protection, and maybe he needs us too." The firelight played across her earnest face, highlighting a wisdom that transcended her years. Mason found himself nodding slowly, her words resonating with something deep inside him. "Well, we certainly need rest," the Reverend announced, breaking the heavy moment. "But the children, time for sleep. We have a long journey tomorrow." As the children settled into their bedrolls, Mason took first watch, positioning himself on a rock overlooking the clearing. The night was still, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of wind through pine needles. Behind him, soft footsteps approached. Emma, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. "I can't sleep," she explained, climbing up beside him. "Can I sit with you for a while?" Mason nodded, shifting to make room for her small form. Together they sat in companionable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, two souls united by loss, finding unexpected comfort in each other's presence. Dawn broke in pale streaks of gold and pink across the eastern sky. Mason hadn't slept. He'd maintained his vigil through the night, watching over the sleeping children with the vigilance of a man who knew exactly how quickly peace could shatter. Emma had eventually dozed off against his shoulder, and he'd carefully carried her back to the wagon without waking her. As the first light touched the clearing, Mason stirred the embers and added kindling to revive the fire. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, dew sparkling on pine needles and grass. The Reverend was the first to wake, adjusting his spectacles as he emerged from his bedroll. "Good morning," he whispered, careful not to disturb the children. "Did you rest at all?" Mason shook his head, pouring coffee grounds into a battered pot. "You should sleep. He can watch over things while you get a few hours." Mason simply shrugged, setting the pot on the fire. Rest wasn't something he sought these days. Sleep brought dreams, and dreams brought his family back, only to take them away again when he woke. One by one, the children stirred. William first, already reaching for his book before he was fully awake. Then Henry, yawning widely and showing his missing tooth. The twins rose together as if synchronized. Emma was last, her honey-colored braids mussed from sleep, her eyes immediately seeking Mason. "You carried me back," she said, not a question, but a statement of fact. Mason nodded, pouring a cup of coffee for the Reverend and offering the man hardtack from his saddlebag. "I dreamed about my mother again," Emma continued, accepting a piece of hardtack for herself. "But it was different this time. She wasn't alone. She was with your Elizabeth and Grace." Mason froze, the coffee pot suspended over the fire. Something cold and sharp twisted beneath his ribs. "They were happy," Emma added quietly. "Elizabeth had her arm around my mother's shoulders. Grace was playing with a wooden horse. They asked me to tell you they're waiting, but not to hurry. They said you still have things to do here." The Reverend choked on his coffee. "Emma, that's quite enough. You shouldn't make up stories about Mr. Blackwood's family." "I'm not making it up," Emma protested, her face solemn. "That's what I saw." Mason set the coffee pot down with deliberate care. His hands trembled slightly. The other children watched in hushed fascination, sensing the weight of the moment. "I believe her," William said suddenly, closing his book. "Emma knows things. At the old orphanage, she knew when the fire was coming. She tried to warn Sister Agnes, but no one listened." The Reverend cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Children often have vivid imaginations." "She told us to sleep by the windows that night," Sarah interrupted. "That's why we got out when the fire started." Mason studied Emma's face. There was no guile there, no childish attempt to gain attention, just that same steady, knowing gaze that had seen through him from the beginning. He reached for his stick and wrote in the dirt, "Your mother's name, Catherine?" Emma answered. "Catherine Rose Miller." Mason wrote again, "What did Grace look like?" Emma didn't hesitate. "Red hair like yours, but curlier, green eyes, a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on her wrist. She was wearing a blue dress in my dream." Mason's breath caught. He had never mentioned Grace's birthmark. The portrait in his locket showed only her face. The Reverend's expression shifted from skepticism to unease. "This is rather unsettling talk for breakfast. Children, let's pack up and continue our journey. We have many miles to cover today." As they prepared to leave, Mason found himself watching Emma with new eyes. Who was this child who spoke to the dead? Was it merely coincidence that she described Grace so accurately? Or was there something more at work? Something beyond his understanding. By mid-morning, they were traveling again, the wagon creaking along the narrow mountain trail. Mason rode ahead, his mind churning with Emma's words. "They asked me to tell you they're waiting, but not to hurry. They said you still have things to do here." What things? For 3 years, he'd wandered without purpose, a ghost drifting through a world that no longer held meaning. What purpose could possibly remain for him? The trail widened as it descended, offering glimpses of Silverpine Valley spread below like a patchwork quilt, squares of farmland, the silver thread of a river, and the distant cluster of buildings that formed the town itself. They were making good progress. With luck, they would reach Silverpine by nightfall. "Mason!" Emma called from the wagon. "Someone's following us." He reined in sharply, turning to look back up the trail. The Reverend pulled the wagon to a stop. "I don't see anyone," Henry said, straining to peer through the trees. "3 riders," Emma insisted. "The same ones from before. They found our trail." Mason drew his revolver and scanned the path behind them. Nothing moved among the pines. No dust rose to indicate pursuit, yet Emma's certainty gave him pause. He gestured for the Reverend to continue forward, while he fell back to guard their rear. They traveled another mile before Mason heard it, the distant thunder of hoofbeats. He spurred his horse alongside the wagon. "Bandits?" the Reverend asked, his face pale. Mason nodded grimly. He motioned for the man to increase speed, but the wagon was already moving as fast as the terrain allowed. The horses were tired, and the wheels struggled on the uneven ground. "There's an old mining cabin ahead," Emma said, pointing down the trail. "We could hide there." Mason's eyebrows rose in question. "I saw it in my dream last night," she explained simply. "After I saw your family." The Reverend looked ready to protest, but Mason had already made his decision. He gestured for the wagon to follow him and urged his horse forward. Sure enough, around the next bend, a dilapidated cabin came into view. half hidden among the pines. It was weathered and listing to one side, but its stone chimney stood strong against the mountain backdrop. Mason dismounted quickly, checking the interior. Dusty but empty. A single room with a rusted stove, a broken table, and not much else. It would have to do. He signaled for the Reverend to bring the wagon around behind the cabin, where it would be hidden from the trail. The children scrambled inside, while Mason and the Reverend unhitched the horses and led them into the trees. "Will they find us?" the Reverend whispered, his hands shaking as he secured the animals. Mason touched a finger to his lips, then pointed to the cabin. They hurried back inside, closing the door behind them. The children huddled in the far corner, William clutching his book to his chest like a shield. The twins held hands, their identical faces pinched with fear. Henry peered through a crack in the wall, his freckles standing out starkly against his pale skin. Only Emma seemed calm, sitting cross-legged on the floor, watching Mason expectantly. "What now?" the Reverend asked, his voice barely audible. Mason removed his hat and set it aside. He checked his revolver, ensuring all 6 chambers were loaded. Then he wrote in the dust on the floor, "Stay quiet. Don't move." Hoofbeats approached, growing louder until they were just outside the cabin. 3 horses, just as Emma had said. Mason positioned himself by the door, motioning for everyone to move away from the windows. "You sure they came this way?" a gruff voice asked. "Tracks lead right up to here," another replied. "But then they disappear." "Check the cabin," a third voice ordered. They might be holed up inside." Mason gripped his revolver tighter. His eyes met Emma's across the room. She gave him a small nod, as if confirming something only the 2 of them understood. Heavy boots crunched on the ground outside. Approaching the door, a shadow fell across the threshold. "If anyone's in there," the voice called, "best come out now. We ain't looking to hurt no one. Just hand over your valuables, and we'll be on our way." Mason pressed his finger to his lips again, warning everyone to remain silent. The Reverend closed his eyes, lips moving in silent prayer. The twins buried their faces against each other's shoulders. Henry and William stared wide-eyed at the door. The handle turned slowly. The hinges creaked. Mason raised his revolver. The door swung open. The door creaked fully open, revealing a bearded man with a jagged scar running from his left eye to his jaw. His hand rested on the pistol at his hip. Behind him, 2 more figures waited, one tall and thin, the other squat with a misshapen nose that had clearly been broken multiple times. Mason moved like lightning. Before the bandit could fully register his presence, Mason had the barrel of his revolver pressed against the man's temple. With his free hand, he grabbed the bandit's gun and relieved him of it in one fluid motion. "What the scarred man started, then fell silent as Mason increased the pressure of the revolver against his skull. "Tucker!" one of the other bandits called. "What did you find?" Mason backed the scarred man into the cabin, keeping him as a shield, and kicked the door wider. The 2 remaining bandits immediately drew their weapons, but faltered when they saw their companion at Mason's mercy. The tall one narrowed his eyes. "Ease up, mister. We don't want no trouble." Mason's expression remained impassive, but his eyes burned with an intensity that made the bandits shift uncomfortably. "Just let Tucker go, and we'll be on our way," the squat one added, his damaged nose flaring as he spoke. Mason shook his head once, deliberately. He nudged the scarred man, Tucker, toward the Reverend, who understood and took the bandit's arms, binding them with a length of rope from the wagon supplies. "What's the meaning of this?" Tucker snarled. "We weren't gonna hurt nobody." 3 armed men chasing a wagon of orphans," the Reverend replied, his voice steadier than Mason expected. "Forgive us if we don't take your word for that." Mason gestured with his revolver for the other 2 bandits to drop their weapons. They hesitated, exchanging glances. "I'd do as he says," Emma said suddenly, stepping forward despite the Reverend's attempt to keep her back. "He's killed men before. He won't hesitate." The quiet certainty in her voice sent a chill through the cabin. Mason himself felt a jolt of surprise at her words, not because they were untrue, but because she spoke them with such conviction, as if she'd witnessed his past firsthand. The bandits slowly lowered their guns to the ground. "Hands where I can see them," the Reverend instructed, gaining confidence. Henry "Fetch more rope from the wagon." As Henry darted out to retrieve the rope, Mason kept his revolver trained on the bandits. The tall one studied him with calculating eyes. "I know you," he said suddenly. "You're Blackwood, Mason Blackwood." Mason's face remained expressionless, but his finger tightened imperceptibly on the trigger. "Thought you were dead," the man continued, "after what happened to your place. Your family." A muscle twitched in Mason's jaw. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken. "Becca," Tucker hissed in warning. "Shut your mouth." But the tall man, Becca, kept his eyes fixed on Mason. "Funny running into you out here. Long way from your old stomping grounds." Emma moved to Mason's side, her small face turned up to his. "He was there," she whispered, "the night of the fire." Mason's gaze snapped to her, then back to Becca. An icy clarity washed over him. This man had been part of the raid that took his family. The realization hit him with physical force, nearly buckling his knees. "The girl's talking nonsense," Becca said quickly, but his eyes darted nervously to the door as if calculating his chances of escape. Henry returned with the rope, and the Reverend began binding the remaining bandits. Mason lowered his revolver, his mind racing. After 3 years of aimless wandering, one of the men responsible for destroying his life had literally walked into his path. It couldn't be coincidence. He looked at Emma, her solemn eyes watching him steadily, and wondered again who or what she really was. "What do we do with them now?" William asked, peering at the bound men from behind his book. "We can't just leave them here," the Reverend said, "and we can't bring them with us to Silver Pine." Mason holstered his revolver and picked up his hat. He gestured toward the bandits, then made a walking motion with his fingers, pointing back up the trail. "You want to march them back to the main road?" The Reverend interpreted, "Leave them for the sheriff's patrol." Mason nodded. "That's a half-day's detour," the Reverend protested. "The children need to reach Silver Pine." Mason's eyes found Emma's. Without words, they communicated. A silent exchange that left the others in the cabin feeling like outsiders witnessing something intimate and inexplicable. "I can guide them," Emma said finally. "I know the way." "Preposterous," the Reverend sputtered. "You're a child. You've never been to Silver Pine." "I've seen it," Emma insisted. "In my dreams. The orphanage with the blue door, the church with the crooked steeple, the apple orchard behind the schoolhouse. I can find it." The Reverend looked to Mason, bewilderment clear on his face. "Mr. Blackwood, surely you don't suggest we let a child lead us while you take these criminals elsewhere?" Mason hesitated. Every instinct told him to stay with Emma and the children, to see them safely to Silver Pine. But Becca's presence had awakened something in him, a chance for answers, perhaps even justice. After 3 years of not knowing exactly who had taken his family from him, he couldn't let this opportunity slip away. He knelt before Emma, meeting her eyes directly. "You need to question him," she said softly. "I understand." Mason nodded, grateful for her perception. "The trail is clear from here," she continued. "We'll follow the river into town. Sister Margaret is expecting us." The Reverend's mouth opened and closed several times. "This is madness," he finally managed. "Mr. Blackwood, I must insist." "Mason needs to do this," Emma interrupted firmly. "And we'll be fine. The bandits were the only danger on this trail." "How could you possibly know that?" the Reverend demanded. "The same way I knew about Grace's birthmark," Emma replied simply. "And the same way I knew these men were following us." An uncomfortable silence followed. The twins exchanged nervous glances. Henry and William looked at Emma with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The bandits shifted uneasily, Becca's calculating gaze moving between Mason and the strange little girl. Mason made his decision. He wrote in the dust on the floor, "Take the main trail. Stay together. I'll find you in Silver Pine." "You promise?" Emma asked. Mason nodded solemnly. "We'll wait for you," she said, "no matter how long it takes." The Reverend sighed in defeat. "Very well, but I want it noted that I consider this extremely irregular." They prepared to part ways. Mason would take the bandits back toward the main road where sheriff's patrols were common, while the Reverend would continue with the children to Silver Pine. As the children climbed back into the wagon, Emma lingered. "He knows where the others are," she whispered to Mason, nodding toward Becca, "the ones who led the raid. He can take you to them. Mason's breath caught. How could she know the questions burning in his mind? When you find them, she continued, her voice taking on an odd, distant quality. Remember what Elizabeth asked. Don't hurry to join them. Your work isn't finished. She reached up and took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his calloused one. For a brief moment, Mason felt a strange sensation, as if someone else's presence flowed through her touch, something familiar and achingly missed. Grace says to look for her in the sunrise, Emma added. That's when she can see you best. A lump formed in Mason's throat. He squeezed her hand gently, unable to respond even if he'd had the words. Emma released him and climbed into the wagon. The Reverend clicked his tongue and the horses started forward. Mason watched them go, the wagon creaking around the bend in the trail until it disappeared from sight. Then he turned to the bandits, his expression hardening. He ain't spoken a word in years, Tucker said nervously to his companions. Oh, now not since the raid on his place. Shut up, Becca hissed. Mason drew his knife and approached Becca slowly. The tall bandit tried to maintain his bravado, but fear leaked into his eyes as Mason came closer. What are you gonna do? Becca asked, his voice rising. You can't just kill us in cold blood. Mason pressed the tip of his knife against Becca's throat, not hard enough to draw blood, but enough to make his intention clear. He wanted answers, and one way or another, he was going to get them. The abandoned mining cabin grew still as Mason stared into Becca's eyes, knife pressed against the man's throat. Outside, wind whispered through pine branches, carrying the scent of coming rain. The other two bandits watched in tense silence, afraid any movement might seal their companion's fate. He wants to know about the raid, Tucker said finally, his voice cracking. Done about his family. Mason's gaze flicked briefly to Tucker, then back to Becca. He eased the pressure of the knife slightly, just enough to allow Becca to speak. It was just a job, Becca rasped, sweat beading on his forehead. Nothing personal. We were hired. Mason's eyes narrowed. He stepped back, keeping the knife ready, and found a piece of charcoal that had fallen from the cabin's decrepit stove. On the dusty floor, he wrote, Who hired you? Becca licked his lips nervously. Man named Hollister. Wesley Hollister. The name hit Mason like a physical blow. Wesley Hollister, his neighbor, a man who had shared meals at his table, who had helped raise his barn, a man who had offered condolences after the raid, who had stood beside Mason at the freshly dug graves. My Hollister wanted your land, Becca continued, watching Mason's reaction carefully. Said there was silver running through it. Offered us good money to drive you out. Mason's hand tightened around the knife. On the floor, he wrote, Drive out, not kill. That was the plan, Tucker interjected. Just scare you folks. Burn the barn, maybe rustle some cattle. Nobody was supposed to die. It went wrong, Becca admitted, his eyes darting between Mason and the door. Your wife, she recognized one of the boys, started shouting his name. Hollister didn't want witnesses after that. Mason's world narrowed to a pinpoint. Elizabeth had recognized one of the raiders, which meant someone from town, someone they knew, had been part of the group that took her life. He wrote again. Who? Hollister's son, Caleb, Becca answered. He rode with us that night. Your wife called out to him, asked him why he was doing this. The boy panicked, started shooting. By the time we got control of him, he trailed off, unwilling to describe what Mason already knew too well. Mason stood motionless, absorbing this revelation. Wesley Hollister, who still lived just outside Silverpine, who had expanded his ranch onto Mason's abandoned property, whose son, Caleb, now worked as a deputy in the sheriff's office. The pieces aligned with sickening clarity. Hollister's powerful in these parts now. The squat bandit with the broken nose spoke up. Got himself elected to the town council last year. Been buying up land all around the valley. Mason knelt and wrote, Where is he now? Silverpine. Same as always, Becca replied. Lives in that big house on the hill overlooking town. Caleb's got a badge now. They think they're untouchable. Mason's mind raced. Emma and the children were headed straight for Silverpine, straight toward the very men responsible for his family's murder. If Hollister learned that someone connected to Mason was in town, especially a strange child who seemed to know things she shouldn't, he had to warn them, had to reach them before they arrived. The wagon rattled along the riverbank, following the winding path towards Silverpine. In the distance, the town's church steeple poked above the treetops, just as Emma had described, crooked slightly to the right, the result of a lightning strike years before. "I still don't understand how you know these things," the Reverend said, glancing sideways at Emma, who sat beside him on the driver's bench. "You've never been to Silverpine before?" Emma kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I see things sometimes, in dreams or when I touch people, like Mason's family," William asked from the back of the wagon. "You really saw them?" Emma nodded. "They're always together. Elizabeth reads to Grace every night, just like she did when they were alive." The twins exchanged wide-eyed glances. Henry looked skeptical but fascinated. "Such talk borders on blasphemy," the Reverend cautioned, though his tone lacked conviction. "The dead rest with the Lord until Judgment Day." "They do rest," Emma agreed, "but sometimes they visit, especially when they have unfinished business." "What business could the dead possibly have?" the Reverend asked. Emma turned her solemn eyes to him. "Helping the living let go of grief, bringing justice for wrongs done, finding peace." A heavy silence fell over the wagon. The children contemplated Emma's words, each considering their own losses, their own unresolved pain. As they rounded a bend in the river, Silverpine came fully into view, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley surrounded by towering pines that gave the town its name. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the main street bustled with afternoon activity. "We've arrived, children," the Reverend announced with relief. "Silverpine Orphanage is just beyond the church. Sister Margaret will be waiting." Emma suddenly stiffened. "We need to stop. We can't go in yet." "What? Why ever not?" the Reverend asked, bewildered. "The man who killed Mason's family is there," she whispered. "If he sees us, we'll be in danger." The Reverend pulled the horses to a halt at the town's edge. "Emma, this has gone far enough. You cannot possibly know such things." "Wesley Hollister," she said firmly. "He hired raiders to drive Mason from his land. His son Caleb was with them. They killed Elizabeth and Grace when they were recognized." The Reverend's face paled. "Wesley Hollister is the most respected man in Silverpine. He's an elder in the church, a town councilman. What you're suggesting is the truth," Emma finished for him. "And he'll know something's wrong if we arrive without Mason. We need to wait." The Reverend studied her face, clearly torn between dismissing her claims and heeding her warning. The other children watched anxiously, sensing the tension. "Mason promised he would find us," Emma continued. "We should make camp here and wait for him." After a long moment, the Reverend sighed. "Very well, one night. If Mr. Blackwood hasn't joined us by morning, we continue to the orphanage as planned." They made camp in a small clearing just outside town, hidden from the main road by a stand of young pines. As darkness fell, the children huddled around a small fire, their faces illuminated by dancing flames. "What if Mason doesn't come?" Henry asked, voicing the fear they all shared. "He will," Emma replied with unwavering certainty. "He has to face the men who took his family. Only then can he find peace." "And what happens after?" William wondered. "Will he take us to the orphanage and then just leave?" Emma stared into the fire, her young face contemplative. "I don't know. That depends on him. And on us." The Reverend, who had been listening silently, cleared his throat. "Children, I feel I must caution you against becoming too attached to Mr. Blackwood. He's a man with his own burdens, his own path. The orphanage will provide for your needs until proper families can be found." "What if we've already found our family?" Rebecca asked quietly, the firelight reflecting in her dark eyes. The Reverend had no answer for that. Miles away, Mason pushed his horse hard along the river trail, the three bandits bound and secured on their own mounts before him. Night was falling fast, and rain had begun to patter against the pine needles. But he didn't slow his pace. Becca had told him everything, how Hollister had orchestrated the raid, how Caleb's panic had turned a simple land grab into murder, how they had torched the house to destroy evidence, how Hollister had paid them extra to keep quiet, then sent them away from the territory with a warning never to return. "We only came back because we heard about the new silver strike north of Silverpine," Tucker had explained. "Didn't know you were still around these parts." Mason's mind mind was fixed on a single purpose now, reaching Emma and the children before they entered Silverpine, before Hollister could learn of their connection to him. The rain grew heavier, slicking the trail and slowing their progress. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by the low rumble of thunder. His horse stumbled on the muddy path, nearly sending him over its head. Mason reined in, forced to acknowledge that continuing in these conditions was too dangerous. They would have to make camp and resume at first light. As he secured the prisoners for the night beneath a rocky overhang, Mason's thoughts turned to Emma. Had she reached Silverpine? Was she safe? The questions burned in his mind, unanswerable in the growing storm. For the first time in 3 years, Mason felt something beyond the numb grief that had been his constant companion. Urgency, purpose, and something else he was afraid to name, something that felt dangerously like hope. Dawn broke gray and misty over the mountains, the night's storm having passed, but leaving the world damp and shrouded. Mason woke instantly, his hand already on his revolver before his eyes fully opened. The bandits remained where he'd secured them, though Becker watched him with calculating eyes that never seemed to rest. Mason rose and checked the horses, which had weathered the storm beneath the rocky overhang. The trail would be muddy, slowing their progress, but they could reach Silverpine by midday if they pushed hard. "You really think you can just ride into town and accuse Wesley Hollister?" Becker asked as Mason tightened the saddle straps. "Man's got half the county in his pocket, sheriff included." Mason ignored him, continuing his preparations with methodical focus. "They'll hang you before you get 2 words out," Tucker added. "Do, or they would, if you spoke at all." Mason turned to them, his expression unchanged, but his eyes conveying a message clearer than words. He would face whatever came, so long as the children were safe. They set out as the mist began to lift, following the river trail towards Silverpine. Mason drove the horses hard, an urgency building in his chest with each passing mile. Something told him time was running short. At the camp outside Silverpine, Emma woke with a start, her heart pounding. The dream still clung to her. Mason riding through rain, lightning illuminating his grim face. Danger closing in from all sides. She scrambled from her bedroll and moved to the edge of their small camp. The town lay quiet in the early morning light, smoke beginning to rise from chimneys as Silverpine stirred to life. The Reverend and other children still slept, exhausted from their journey. Emma stared toward the trail they had followed the previous day, willing Mason to appear. "Hurry," she whispered. "They know we're here." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached her ears. Not from the river trail, but from the direction of town. Emma ducked behind a pine tree, peering cautiously through the branches. A rider appeared, a young man with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest, his face handsome in a hard sort of way. He reined in at the edge of the trees, studying the ground carefully. Then he dismounted and knelt, examining their tracks where they had turned off the main road. Emma's breath caught. Caleb Hollister, the man from her visions, the one who had fired the fatal shots that killed Mason's family. Now he was following their trail, getting closer to their hiding place with each passing moment. She backed away silently and hurried to wake the Reverend. "Someone's coming," she whispered urgently, shaking his shoulder. "A deputy. We need to hide." The Reverend blinked groggily. "What? Emma, what time is it?" "There's no time," she insisted, already moving to wake the others. "He's almost here." The Reverend sat up, alarmed by her intensity. "Who's almost here?" "Caleb Hollister, the man who killed Mason's family. He's tracking us." Before the Reverend could respond, a voice called from the edge of their camp. "Hello there, this is Deputy Hollister. Show yourselves." The children froze, eyes wide with fear. The Reverend stood slowly, adjusting his spectacles. "Good morning, Deputy," he called, stepping forward. "Reverend Thomas Holloway here, with orphans bound for Sister Margaret's care. We arrived late yesterday and decided to camp rather than disturb the town at night." Caleb Hollister emerged from the trees, one hand resting casually on his holstered pistol. He was younger than Emma had expected, perhaps 25, with his father's strong jawline and cold eyes. "Mighty unusual to camp outside town when there's beds waiting," he observed, gaze sweeping over the children. "Sister Margaret sent word you never arrived. She was concerned. As I said, we didn't wish to impose after nightfall." the Reverend explained. "We intended to present ourselves this morning." Caleb nodded slowly, but his eyes had fixed on Emma. "I don't recall Millbrook Orphanage having so many children. Where'd this one come from?" Emma met his gaze steadily, feeling a cold knot form in her stomach. Something in his eyes told her he knew, or at least suspected, who she was. "All these children were under Sister Agnes's care in Millbrook," the Reverend said, moving subtly to place himself between Emma and the deputy. "That's so." Caleb's hand hadn't moved from his pistol. "Funny thing, we got word about a man traveling with orphan. Man matching the description of Mason Blackwood." The Reverend paled slightly. "We did receive assistance from a traveler yesterday. He helped when our wagon was stuck. I didn't catch his name. Tall fellow, red hair, doesn't speak. I suppose that description fits," the Reverend admitted. "Is there some trouble?" Caleb's eyes hardened. "Mason Blackwood is wanted for questioning in connection with a stagecoach robbery near Denton County." "Where is he now?" Emma felt a flash of anger. The lie was so transparent, so obviously fabricated on the spot. Mason had never robbed anyone. This was just an excuse to find him, to silence him before he could reveal the truth about the Hollisters. He continued on his way, the Reverend said carefully, "headed north, I believe." Caleb studied the Reverend's face, clearly skeptical. "I'll need you folks to come into town with me. My father, that is, Councilman Hollister, will want to hear about this Blackwood sighting personally." Emma caught William's eye, giving a tiny shake of her head. They couldn't go with Caleb. Once in town, under the Hollisters' control, they would be used as bait to lure Mason into a trap. "Of course," the Reverend replied, oblivious to the danger. "Children, gather your things. It seems we'll be meeting the councilman before Sister Margaret." As the others began packing, Emma hung back. She needed to warn Mason somehow, needed to prevent him from riding straight into Hollister's hands. But how? Her opportunity came when Caleb turned to secure his horse. Emma slipped away silently, ducking behind the wagon and then into the trees. She had seen the river trail in her dreams. If she could reach it before Mason, she might intercept him in time. She ran as fast as her small legs would carry her, heart pounding in her chest. Behind her, she heard the Reverend call her name. Then Caleb's sharper voice demanding to know where she had gone. But Emma didn't slow. Mason had saved them. Now it was her turn to save him. The river bent sharply, where the trail descended towards Silverpine, offering travelers their first clear view of the town. Mason reined in at this overlook, studying the settlement below with narrowed eyes. After 3 years of drifting, he was about to return to the place that had taken everything from him. "You're a dead man, Blackwood," Becca said from behind him. "Hollister will see to that." Mason ignored him, focusing instead on planning his approach. He needed to find Emma and the children first, ensure their safety before confronting Hollister. But where would they be? Had they reached the orphanage? Or had Emma convinced the Reverend to wait as she'd promised? A movement on the trail below caught his eye, a small figure running toward him, familiar honey-colored braids flying behind her. Emma. Mason spurred his horse forward, leaving the bandits momentarily forgotten. Something was wrong. Emma wouldn't have left the others unless there was danger. They met on a switchback. Emma, breathless and wide-eyed with urgency. Mason swung down from his saddle, kneeling before her. "Caleb found us," she gasped. "He's taking everyone to his father. They know you're here. They're saying you're a robber, that you're wanted." Mason's jaw tightened. He had expected Hollister to fight back, but not to move so quickly. "He recognized me," Emma continued. "I don't know how, but he knew I wasn't from Millbrook. The way he looked at me." She shuddered. "There's something else, Mason. Something I haven't told you." Mason raised an eyebrow in question. "I was there," she whispered. "The night of the fire. My mother and I were traveling with a trading party. We camped near your ranch. When the raiders came, when the shooting started, my mother went to help." Her eyes filled with tears. "She ran toward your house while I hid in the wagon. She never came back." Mason stared at her, understanding dawning like a physical pain in his chest. Emma hadn't just been seeing visions. She had witnessed the raid firsthand. Her mother had died, trying to save his family. "Caleb saw me that night," Emma continued. "And I saw his face in the firelight when he..." She couldn't finish the sentence. "If he remembers, if he realizes I can identify him." Mason placed his hands on her shoulders. steadying her. Then he pointed to the bandits on horseback behind him. "You found them," Emma breathed. "The ones who helped raid your ranch." Mason nodded grimly. "But Hollister controls the sheriff," she reminded him. "But if you bring them in, tell what happened." Mason's expression hardened with resolve. He wouldn't be bringing the bandits to the sheriff. He would be taking them straight to Hollister himself, confronting the man with living proof of his crimes, forcing a reckoning 3 years overdue. Emma seemed to read his intention in his eyes. "You can't just ride into town. They'll kill you before you can expose them." Mason touched her cheek gently, trying to reassure her. Then he stood and helped her onto his horse. "I have a plan," Emma said suddenly, "but you have to trust me." And she hesitated. "You have to speak again. Your silence won't protect you anymore. It's time to use your voice." Wesley Hollister's home dominated the eastern hill overlooking Silver Pine, a 2-story structure of stone and timber that seemed to glower down at the modest buildings clustered below it. Inside its study, Wesley stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back as he watched his son approach with the Reverend and 4 children in tow. "One's missing," he murmured to himself, counting the small figures. He had received word from his contacts in Millbrook that 5 orphans had survived the fire. Where was the 5th? The heavy oak door opened, and Sheriff Mills entered, removing his hat. "They're here, Councilman. Caleb's bringing them up now." Wesley turned, a practiced smile settling on his features. At 55, he remained an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked dark hair and the confident bearing of a man accustomed to power. Only the deep lines around his eyes and the slight tremor in his right hand betrayed the strain of recent weeks. "I understand one of the children is missing," he said. The sheriff nodded. "Little girl. Ran off when Caleb approached their camp. He says she was acting strange, watching him like she knew something." A flicker of unease crossed Wesley's face. "Find her, immediately. Caleb's already sent 2 men to search." "Good. And what of Blackwood? Any sign of him?" "Nothing yet. But if he's in the area..." "He is," Wesley cut in sharply. "I've waited 3 years for him to surface." Mills. 3 years wondering if he'd return, if he'd somehow learned the truth. "I won't let him destroy everything I've built." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Begging your pardon, sir, but Blackwood hasn't spoken a word since that night. Even if he has suspicions, who'd believe a mute drifter over the most respected man in the county?" Wesley's gaze hardened. "I'm not taking chances. If Blackwood appears, I want him arrested on sight. The stagecoach robbery charge should suffice until more permanent arrangements can be made." Before the sheriff could respond, voices sounded in the hallway. Wesley straightened his jacket and arranged his features into a mask of benevolent concern. The door opened again, and Caleb ushered in the Reverend and children. The Reverend looked nervous, but maintained his dignity, while the children huddled close together, eyes darting around the opulent room. "Reverend Holloway," Wesley greeted warmly, extending his hand. "Welcome to Silver Pine. I understand you've had quite a journey." The Reverend accepted the handshake with evident relief. "Indeed, Councilman, your hospitality is most appreciated after the trials we've faced." Wesley nodded sympathetically, then turned his attention to the children. "And these must be the poor orphans from Millbrook. Such a tragedy about the fire?" His gaze lingered on each child, noting their reactions. The freckled boy and the one with the book seemed merely intimidated, while the twin girls clung to each other, eyes downcast. "I'm told there should be 5 children," Wesley remarked casually. "Yet I count only 4. The Reverend paled slightly. "Ah, yes. Emma, she wandered off this morning, quite unexpectedly." "Children do get curious," Wesley said, his tone light though his eyes remained sharp. "I'm sure my men will find her soon. In the meantime, please make yourselves comfortable. I've arranged refreshments in the dining room." As the Reverend herded the children toward the door, Wesley added, "One moment. I understand you encountered a traveler yesterday, a man who assisted with your wagon." The Reverend hesitated. "Yes, a kind stranger who helped when we were stuck. He didn't give his name. Tall fellow, red hair, doesn't speak." "I believe so. Yes." Wesley exchanged glances with his son. "Interesting. This man is wanted for questioning in connection with a serious crime. If you see him again, I trust you'll inform the sheriff immediately." The Reverend nodded uncertainly. "And of course, Councilman." As they left the study, William caught Henry's eye and mouthed silently, They're lying. Henry gave an almost imperceptible nod. They needed to find Emma and Mason before the Hollisters did. You want me to do what? Mason's voice emerged as a harsh rasp, rusty from 3 years of disuse. The sound startled even him, strange and foreign to his ears. Emma's eyes widened, but she pressed on. It's the only way. We need everyone to hear the truth at once. The whole town, not just the sheriff. They sat hidden in a small cave, overlooking the river, planning their next move while keeping the bandits secured nearby. Mason rubbed his throat, the act of speaking again feeling like working a muscle long atrophied. Sunday service, Emma continued. Everyone in Silverpine attends, even the Hollisters. They sit in the front pew, making sure everyone sees their devotion. Her voice took on a bitter edge unusual for one so young. If you confront them there with witnesses and evidence, they can't simply have you arrested or killed without raising questions. The bandits, Mason managed, each word requiring conscious effort. We bring them in during the sermon, Emma explained. Make them confess what they told you about the raid, about who hired them. Mason shook his head. Too dangerous. For you, for the others. Emma's expression grew solemn. My mother died trying to help your family, Mason. I've carried that night with me for 3 years. The sounds, the flames, the faces of the men who did it. I need this to end too. Mason studied her, this child with ancient eyes, who had somehow become entwined with his fate. She had lost as much as he had that night, had carried her own silence in a different way. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, the words coming easier now. That you were there. I was afraid, she admitted. When I first saw you on the mountain pass, I recognized you from before, from happier time. I'd seen you once in town with your wife and daughter, all of you laughing. After the fire, I thought you were dead too. When I realized who you were, I wasn't sure how to tell you. Mason reached out hesitantly and took her small hand in his. Your mother was brave. So was your Elizabeth, Emma replied. She shielded Grace with her body. She died protecting her child, just like my mother died trying to help your family. A painful lump formed in Mason's throat. No one had told him how Elizabeth had died. He had found them already gone, had imagined 1,000 terrible scenarios. Learning she had died as she had lived, fierce in her protection of their daughter, brought a bittersweet comfort he hadn't expected. Tomorrow is Sunday, Emma continued. The service starts at 10. We need to move the bandits somewhere secure tonight, then bring them to the church at the right moment. Mason nodded slowly, his mind working through the risks, the possibilities for failure. It was dangerous, perhaps foolhardy, but after 3 years of carrying his grief in silence, the prospect of speaking the truth, of naming his family's killers aloud, ignited something within him that felt like purpose. What about the others? He asked. Henry, William, the twins. Hollister has them at his house, Emma explained, but they'll be at the service too. The whole town will see them presented to Sister Margaret as the newest orphans in her care. Mason's jaw tightened. If anything goes wrong, it won't, Emma insisted with a certainty beyond her years. Grace told me. Mason's breath caught. What? In my dream last night, Grace said it's time for her father to speak again, to tell the truth so everyone can heal. She said to tell you she's proud of you for finding your voice. Mason turned away, overwhelmed by emotion. The idea that his daughter's spirit somehow guided this child, that Elizabeth and Grace were more than just memories. It bordered on madness. And yet Emma knew things she couldn't possibly know, spoke truths that resonated deep in his soul. We'll need help, he said finally, his voice growing stronger with each word. Can't move 3 prisoners alone. Emma smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. I know just who to ask. As darkness fell over Silverpine, Sister Margaret walked the dormitory halls of her orphanage, checking on each child before retiring for the night. The 4 new orphans from Millbrook had arrived that afternoon, escorted by Councilman Hollister himself, a fact that struck her as odd, given that orphans rarely warranted such high-level attention. Odder still was the councilman's insistence that she report immediately if a 5th child, a girl named Emma, should appear. The Reverend had seemed unusually nervous, the children unnaturally quiet. Something wasn't right, but she couldn't quite place what. A soft tapping at her office window startled her from her thoughts. Sister Margaret crossed the room cautiously and peered into the darkness. A small face looked back at her, a girl with honey-colored braids and solemn eyes. Sweet Mary, Sister Margaret gasped, quickly opening the window. You must be Emma. Everyone's been looking for you, child. I know. Emma whispered. "But I need your help, sister. It's about Mason Blackwood." Sister Margaret's hand flew to her throat. "Mason is alive after all this time." Emma nodded. "And he's ready to speak the truth about what happened to his family. But he needs your help tonight." The nun hesitated only briefly before reaching for her shawl. "Tell me what he needs." Dawn painted Silverpine's church steeple in golden light as Sister Margaret led Mason and Emma through the cemetery behind the building. The bandits followed, hands bound and mouths gagged, prodded forward by two men Sister Margaret had vouched for, the church caretaker and the blacksmith, both old friends of Mason's from before the tragedy. "The cellar door's through here," Sister Margaret whispered, lifting her skirt slightly to navigate between weathered gravestones. Her silver-streaked hair was tucked beneath her habit, her usually kind face set with determination. "And no one will think to look for them in the church's own root cellar." Mason nodded, grateful for her help. Sister Margaret had been like family once. She had delivered grace into the world and had mourned alongside him when he buried his wife and daughter. Learning that he still lived had brought tears to her eyes, but she had quickly transformed grief into purpose, gathering trusted allies through the night. "Hollister's been asking questions about you for years," she told Mason, as they secured the bandits in the cool darkness beneath the church. Whenever travelers mentioned a mute drifter with red hair, he'd send Caleb to investigate. "I always wondered why." "Now you know," Mason said, his voice still rough but growing stronger with each use. Speaking again felt like removing a heavy weight he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. Sister Margaret studied him with compassionate eyes. "Your voice suits you, Mason. It always did. Silence never seemed natural for a man who once sang to his daughter every night." Emma, who had been keeping watch at the cellar entrance, turned at this, he sang. A ghost of a smile touched Mason's lips. "Every night, same lullaby." Elizabeth used to say his voice was what she fell in love with first, Sister Margaret told Emma. And before she even saw his face, she heard him singing by the river and followed the sound. Mason's throat tightened at the memory. For 3 years, he had locked away these remembrances, too painful to revisit. Now they emerged like pressed flowers, fragile but intact, cherished mementos of a life once lived. "The service begins in 3 hours," Sister Margaret said, returning to practical matters. "Wesley and Caleb always arrive early to greet parishioners at the door, a show of their Christian charity." The last words carried a bitter edge. "The other children will be brought by Reverend Holloway. I've arranged for you both to enter through the vestry. No one will see you until the moment is right." Mason checked the ropes binding the bandits one final time. Becca watched him with hatred, while Tucker seemed resigned to his fate. The third bandit, the one with the broken nose, had barely spoken since their capture. "What if they refuse to talk?" Emma asked, voicing the concern that had nagged at her through the night. "They'll talk," Mason assured her, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Becca knows Hollister will hang them out to dry. Their only chance is to tell the truth." As they climbed the cellar stairs, back into the early morning light, Mason placed a hand on Sister Margaret's shoulder. "Thank you," he said simply. She covered his hand with her own. "Elizabeth and Grace deserved justice long ago. I'm just sorry you've had to carry this burden alone for so long." She glanced at Emma. "Though perhaps you weren't as alone as you thought." Mason and Emma spent the next hours hidden in Sister Margaret's private quarters at the orphanage, watching through lace curtains as Silverpine came to life. Townsfolk in their Sunday best began making their way toward the church, families walking together along the dusty main street. "There," Emma whispered, pointing to a stately carriage approaching from the direction of the hill. "And the Hollisters." Mason's jaw tightened as he watched Wesley Hollister descend from the carriage, extending a hand to help his wife, a severe woman in an expensive dress whose smile seemed permanently fixed in place. Caleb followed, adjusting his vest with the silver deputy's badge prominently displayed. They moved like royalty, accepting deferential nods from townspeople as they made their way to the church entrance. "And then there's the others," Emma noted, as another wagon approached, bearing Reverend Holloway and the 4 orphans. The children looked subdued, dressed in donated clothes that didn't quite fit. As they passed below the window, William glanced up, as if sensing their presence. Mason gave a subtle nod, which the boy acknowledged with the barest tilt of his head. "It's time," Sister Margaret announced, entering the room with a bundle in her arms. "I brought you something, Mason. I thought, well, I thought you might want to look like yourself again, not a drifter. She unfolded the bundle to reveal clean clothes. A white shirt, dark vest, and black coat, similar to what he had worn in his ranching days. Mason touched the fabric, unexpectedly moved by the gesture. "They were my late brothers," Sister Margaret explained. "Similar to your old style. A man should face his enemies standing tall." Mason changed quickly while Emma and Sister Margaret waited outside. The clothes fit well enough, and when he caught his reflection in a small mirror, he hardly recognized himself. The wild beard and unkempt hair remained, but underneath was a shadow of the man he had once been. Sister Margaret led them through back alleys to the church's vestry entrance. Inside, they could hear the congregation singing hymns, voices raised in praise, unaware of the reckoning about to unfold. The caretaker and blacksmith waited for them, confirming that the bandits were ready. "Bring them in when I signal," Mason instructed, his voice low but clear. "Not before." The men nodded solemnly. Sister Margaret squeezed Mason's hand. "I'll be in my usual place, third pew on the left." "God be with you, Mason." She slipped through the door into the main chapel, leaving Mason and Emma alone in the small antechamber. Emma looked up at him, her young face solemn. "Are you afraid?" Mason considered the question. "Not of Hollister," he answered truthfully. "Not of what happens to me." "Then what?" "Of failing, of letting them get away with it again." He knelt to meet her eyes. "Or of not protecting you and the others." Emma reached out and straightened his collar with a gesture so motherly it nearly broke his heart. "You won't fail," she said with absolute certainty. "We won't let you." Through the door, they heard Reverend Holloway's voice rising in sermon. "Today we welcome new souls to our community, children who have endured great loss and suffering, yet who stand before us as testimonies to God's enduring grace." "That's our cue," Emma whispered. "He'll present each child, then invite Councilman Hollister to say a few words of welcome. That's when we enter." Mason nodded, steeling himself for what was to come. 3 years of silence, of drifting without purpose, had led to this moment. For Elizabeth, for Grace, for Emma's mother, for all of them, he would speak the truth. The Reverend's voice continued. "Henry Fulton, William Clark, and the twins, Sarah and Rebecca Thompson. These children have journeyed far to find sanctuary among us." Mason and Emma moved to the door, listening intently. And though one child remains missing, young Emma Miller, who wandered from our camp yesterday, we trust in the Lord's protection over her until she is found. A murmur went through the congregation at this news. Mason could almost feel Wesley Hollister's tension from where he stood. Now, the Reverend concluded, I invite our esteemed Councilman Hollister to offer a few words of welcome to these young souls. Footsteps echoed on wooden floorboards as Wesley Hollister approached the pulpit. His voice, smooth and practiced, filled the church. Friends and neighbors, it is our Christian duty to care for these orphaned children. Silver Pine has always opened its arms to those in need, and today we embrace these 4 young souls who have lost so much. Mason's hand found the door handle. It is in times of hardship that a community reveals its true character, Hollister continued. And then I stand before you proud of the character Silver Pine has shown, not just today, but over the years I have been privileged to serve as your councilman. Emma squeezed Mason's free hand, a silent confirmation that the moment had come. We must always protect the innocent among us. Hollister's voice rang out, rich with false sincerity. Always stand for justice and truth in a world too often darkened by violence and deceit. Mason pushed the door open. Light from the stained glass windows cast colored shadows across the wooden pews packed with Silver Pine's citizens. At the pulpit, Wesley Hollister stood mid-sentence, his back to the vestry door. In the front row, Caleb sat beside his mother, while Reverend Holloway hovered nervously near the orphans. Mason stepped into the church, Emma at his side. His boots echoed loudly on the wooden floor, causing heads to turn, whispers to rise. Wesley Hollister paused in his speech, turning to identify the disruption. Their eyes met across the chapel. Mason Blackwood and the man who had orchestrated his family's murder. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Mason spoke, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent church. You're right about one thing, Hollister. It is time for truth. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Wesley Hollister's face drained of color as he stared at the ghost he'd believed long gone. For 3 years, years. He had convinced himself that Mason Blackwood had either died in some distant territory or would never dare return. Yet here he stood, no longer the broken, silent drifter, but a man transformed by purpose. Mason Blackwood, Wesley managed, quickly recovering his composure. "You're interrupting a church service, and I believe there's a warrant for your arrest." Sheriff Mills rose from his pew, hand moving to his holstered pistol, but Mason's steady gaze stopped him. "There's no warrant," Mason said, his voice strong despite years of disuse. "Just a lie. One of many you've told, Hollister." Murmurs spread through the congregation. Many recognized Mason despite his changed appearance. He had been well respected before tragedy struck, a man known for his honesty and fair dealings. Caleb Hollister stood abruptly. "This man is delusional. Grief drove him mad after his family died in that tragic fire." "It wasn't a fire that killed them," Mason countered, stepping farther into the church. Emma remained at his side, her small face set with determination. "It was raiders. Raiders hired by your father." The murmurs grew louder. Wesley forced a laugh. "This is absurd. Sheriff, remove this man before he further desecrates our service with these wild accusations." "Tell them, councilman," Mason pressed, moving steadily forward. "Tell them how you wanted my land, how you discovered silver running through the eastern ridge, how you sent men to drive us out, to burn us out if necessary." Wesley's laugh faltered. "You have no proof of these delusions." Mason turned toward the vestry door and nodded. The caretaker and blacksmith appeared, pushing the three bandits before them, hands bound and faces grim. "I have them," Mason said simply. "The very men you hired, men who've confessed everything." The congregation erupted in shocked exclamations. Sister Margaret rose from her pew, moving to stand beside Mason in silent support. The Reverend looked bewildered, glancing between the Hollisters and Mason as if seeing both for the first time. "These men are known criminals," Wesley countered desperately. "Their word means nothing. Untie Becker," Mason instructed the blacksmith, who complied, removing the tall bandit's gag. Becker worked his jaw, eyes darting between Mason and Wesley Hollister. The church had fallen silent, every person leaning forward, witnessing a drama none had expected on this Sunday morning. "Tell them," Mason said quietly. "Tell them who hired you 3 years ago to raid the Blackwood Ranch." Becker hesitated, then straightened his shoulders. "Wesley Hollister paid us to drive Blackwood off his land, said to scare him bad enough he'd never come back, burn the barn, rustle some cattle, make it look like Apache raiders." Gasps and cries of shock filled the church. Wesley's wife covered her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Whether at the revelation or at her husband's impending downfall wasn't clear. "It wasn't supposed to end in killing," Becker continued, his voice growing stronger. But the woman, Blackwood's wife, she recognized Caleb, called him by name. All eyes turned to Caleb Hollister, who had gone rigid in the front pew. "She'd been kind to him in town," Becker explained. "Always had a smile for him, gave him pie once when he helped her load supplies. When she saw him that night, she called out, asked why he was there with us. The boy panicked, started shooting." "Lies," Caleb shouted, lunging forward only to be restrained by Sheriff Mills, whose face had hardened as the truth unfolded. "After that, Hollister paid us extra," Becker concluded. "Told us to disappear, never come back to the territory. Said he'd handle the rest, make sure everyone believed it was just a tragic accident, maybe Indian raiders." Wesley Hollister's carefully constructed facade crumbled before the congregation's eyes. The respected councilman, the pillar of the community, revealed as an architect of murder for profit. "You killed my mother too," Emma said suddenly, her clear voice carrying through the stunned silence. "She ran to help when she heard the shooting. She was at our camp nearby." Caleb's eyes widened in recognition. "The trading party," he whispered. "The woman who tried to stop us." Emma nodded, tears filling her eyes, but her voice steady. "I saw you. I saw your face in the firelight when you shot her. I've remembered it every day for 3 years." Henry stood up from where he sat with the other orphans. "Emma saved us," he announced. "She knew the fire was coming at Millbrook Orphanage. She warned us to sleep by the windows. She knew about Silver Pine without ever being here," William added, joining Henry. "She knew about Mason's daughter's birthmark, things no one told her." The twins rose next, their synchronized movements drawing all eyes. "She knows things," Sarah said. "Important things." Rebecca finished. Sister Margaret stepped forward. "I've known Emma less than a day, but I believe her. Just as I've known Mason Blackwood most of his life and know him to be an honest man who loved his family more than anything in this world." The Reverend cleared his throat nervously. "I must admit, the child has demonstrated unusual perceptions during our journey." A heavy silence fell over the church. Wesley Hollister looked around desperately, seeing his carefully constructed world crumbling before his eyes. His gaze fell on his son, then moved to the exit. "This changes nothing," he declared suddenly, his voice brittle with defiance. "The word of criminals and orphans against a councilman, against my family's reputation in this county. Who will believe you?" "I believe them," Sheriff Mills said, his weathered face grave as he released Caleb and stepped away. "I've had my suspicions about that night for years, things that didn't add up. And I'm not the only one." Several townspeople nodded, rising from their pews to stand with Mason. "The Blackwood raid never sat right with me," the blacksmith announced. "Mason was my friend. I knew he'd never leave a lantern burning in that barn. He was too careful. And the bullet holes in the house," another man called out. "Apaches don't use that caliber." Wesley's face contorted with rage. With a sudden, desperate movement, he lunged forward and grabbed Emma, pulling her against him as he drew a small derringer from his coat pocket. "Stay back!" he shouted, pressing the weapon to Emma's temple. "All of you!" The church erupted in cries of alarm. Mason stepped forward, hands raised placatingly. "Let her go, Hollister," he said, his voice low and deadly calm. "This is between you and me." "Nothing is between you and me anymore," Wesley snarled. "You should have stayed gone, Blackwood. You should have stayed silent." Emma remained perfectly still in his grasp, her eyes fixed on Mason. There was no fear in her gaze, only a strange, calm certainty. "Look at the window," she whispered to Wesley. Perhaps it was the eerie confidence in her voice, or some primal instinct for self-preservation. But Wesley's eyes darted briefly to the stained glass window behind the pulpit. Sunlight streamed through the colored panes, casting the image of a fiery angel onto the church floor directly before him. In that split second of distraction, Mason moved. His hand closed around Wesley's wrist, forcing the derringer upward as it discharged, the bullet embedding harmlessly in the wooden ceiling. With his other arm, he pulled Emma free, pushing her towards Sister Margaret's protective embrace. Wesley howled in rage and pain as Mason twisted the weapon from his grasp. Caleb started forward to aid his father, but Sheriff Mills intercepted him, pinning his arms behind his back. "Caleb Hollister, Wesley Hollister, you're both under arrest for the murders of Elizabeth and Grace Blackwood, Catherine Miller, and for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted kidnapping," the sheriff announced formally. "Reverend, I believe this concludes today's service." As the sheriff and his hastily deputized assistants led the Hollisters away, the congregation erupted in a chaos of exclamations and questions. Mason found himself surrounded by townspeople offering belated condolences, expressions of outrage on his behalf, and awkward welcomes back to the community he had fled. Through it all, he kept Emma close by his side, her small hand firmly in his. When the crowd finally parted enough to give them space, he knelt before her. "You knew," he said quietly. "You knew what would happen when he grabbed you." Emma nodded. "I saw it last night in my dream. Grace showed me. She said, 'Tell him to watch for the angel in the window.' I didn't understand until that moment." Mason swallowed hard. "I could have lost you too." "No," Emma said with simple certainty. "And that's not why we found each other." The other orphans pushed through the crowd to join them, Henry's freckled face alight with excitement, William clutching his book like a shield against the overwhelming emotions. The twins, wide-eyed but smiling. "What happens now?" William asked, the question hanging in the air between them. Mason looked at the 5 children gathered around him, orphans who had somehow become his responsibility, his purpose. Especially Emma, this strange, solemn child who had helped him find his voice again, who had suffered losses that mirrored his own. "Now," he said, the words coming more easily with each use, "we figure out what comes next. Together." Autumn painted the mountains in fire fiery hues of gold and crimson as Mason stood on the newly built porch of his homestead. The land had changed in the 3 years of his absence. Saplings had sprouted in the meadow, the creek had carved a slightly different path, and wildflowers now grew where his old house had stood. But the mountains remained steadfast, watching over the valley with ancient patience. 3 months had passed since that fateful Sunday in Silver Pines Church. The Hollisters' trial had been swift, justice delivered through testimony from the bandits, the orphans, and Mason himself. Wesley and Caleb Hollister now awaited hanging in the territorial prison, their appeals exhausted, their power and influence evaporated like morning dew. The silver mine that Wesley had coveted was indeed on Mason's land, though smaller than the councilman had believed. Still, it provided enough wealth to rebuild, not just a house, but a home, one with 6 bedrooms. "Mason," Emma called from inside. "Henry's stuck on the roof again." Mason smiled and shook his head. Henry's adventurous spirit had led to similar predicaments at least once a week since they'd settled here. He walked around to the side of the house where, sure enough, the freckle-faced boy sat stranded on the sloping roof, looking simultaneously proud and embarrassed. "The view's real nice from up here," Henry offered by way of explanation. "I'm sure it is," Mason replied, his voice still rough-edged but growing stronger each day. "Ma, but Sister Margaret's bringing apple pie for supper, and you'll miss it if you break your neck." The mention of Sister Margaret's legendary apple pie was motivation enough. Henry carefully made his way to the ladder Mason positioned for him, descending with more caution than he'd shown going up. Inside, the house hummed with activity. William sat by the fire, reading aloud to the twins, who were mending clothes with surprisingly deft fingers for girls so young. Emma stood at the stove, stirring a pot of stew with the serious concentration she brought to every task. This was their rhythm now, a family forged through shared trauma and healing. Sister Margaret had helped navigate the legal complexities, ensuring Mason could become guardian to all 5 children. There had been questions, of course. A single man raising 5 orphans raised eyebrows, even in a territory accustomed to unconventional arrangements. But the story of their journey, of Emma's intuition that had led to justice, and of Mason finding his voice again, had become something of a legend in Silver Pine. Few questioned the rightness of their unusual family. A knock at the door announced Sister Margaret's arrival. She entered with the promised pie and news from town. "The Reverend's leaving," she announced as she set her burden on the table. "Says he's called to mission work in California." Mason nodded, unsurprised. Reverend Holloway had never quite recovered from the shock of discovering he'd been manipulated by the Hollisters. His faith remained intact, but had been transformed into something that required a fresh start. "Who'll replace him?" William asked, looking up from his book. "That remains to be seen," Sister Margaret replied, "though I did mention to the church elders that Mason here has a fine voice for sermons, now that he's using it again." Mason snorted. "I've only just started speaking to people. Don't think I'm ready for preaching." "You'd be surprised what you're ready for," Sister Margaret said with a knowing smile. 6 months ago, would you have imagined this?" She gestured around the bustling kitchen at the children who now looked to him for guidance and protection. Mason conceded the point with a slight nod. Life had taken him down paths he could never have foreseen, through deeper darkness and, surprisingly, toward brighter light than he had believed possible after losing Elizabeth and Grace. After supper, while the twins and Henry played checkers and William read by lamplight, Mason found Emma sitting on the porch steps, gazing at the stars that were beginning to appear in the deepening twilight. "You're quiet tonight," he observed, settling beside her. "Just listening," she replied. "To what?" Emma smiled softly. "The world, the stars. My mother sometimes, Grace occasionally." Mason had come to accept Emma's unusual perceptions. Whether they were truly visitations from beyond or simply a child's way of processing grief didn't matter. They brought comfort. And after years of pain, he had learned the value of comfort in whatever form it arrived. "What do they say?" he asked. That we're right where we're supposed to be. She leaned against his arm. Grace likes that you're singing again. Mason had indeed begun singing in recent weeks, first just humming while he worked, then soft lullabies when the twins had nightmares, and finally full songs around the evening fire. The same lullaby he had once sung to Grace now soothed 5 different children to sleep. I've been thinking, Emma said suddenly, about the orphanage fire in Millbrook. Mason waited, giving her space to continue. And I think maybe I knew about it before it happened. Not just that night when I told everyone to sleep by the windows. I think I knew days before but didn't understand what I was seeing. Mason considered this. You've always had these vision, Emma nodded. My mother said I had the knowing, said her grandmother had it too. I used to think it was normal, that everyone saw things before they happened. Does it frighten you? Mason asked gently. Sometimes, she admitted, but not as much anymore. Not since I found you. It feels like maybe there's a reason for it. Mason put his arm around her small shoulders. There's a reason for you, Emma, that I'm certain of. They sat in companionable silence as stars emerged in greater numbers, pinpricks of light in the vast darkness. In the distance, an owl called. A lonely sound that nevertheless spoke of life continuing, of nature's rhythms unbroken by human tragedy. Will you tell me about Elizabeth? Emma asked suddenly. Not about how she died, about how she lived. Mason's throat tightened, but not with the paralyzing grief that had once silenced him. This was a gentler ache, the bittersweet pain of treasured memories. She laughed a lot, he began, the words coming easier than he expected. Even when things were hard, and they often were, building a life out here. She had a garden where she grew sunflowers taller than me, said they reminded her to always look toward the light. Emma listened intently as Mason spoke of Elizabeth's determination, her kindness, her fierce protection of their daughter. He told of Grace's first steps, her fascination with butterflies, her habit of naming every animal on the ranch, even the chickens. As he spoke, Mason realized he was smiling. The memories no longer felt like wounds, but like gifts, precious moments that had shaped him, that remained part of him, even as he built this new life. The front door creaked open, and the other children spilled onto the porch, drawn by the storytelling. Tell us more about before, Henry urged, settling at Mason's feet. About the ranch when it was yours and Elizabeth's, William added, and Grace, the twins said in unison. So Mason continued, his voice growing stronger with each story, each memory shared. The children listened, rapt, occasionally asking questions or laughing at funny moments. Through his words, Elizabeth and Grace lived again, not as ghosts that haunted him, but as beloved figures who had helped shape the man who now guided these 5 orphans. Later, after the children had been tucked into bed, Mason returned to the porch alone. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the black velvet sky. He thought of the moment on the mountain pass when he had first encountered the Wagon of Orphans, how close he had come to riding away, to remaining locked in his silent grief. Thank you, he whispered to the night, to whatever fate or providence had placed Emma and the others in his path. From inside came the soft sounds of sleeping children, his children now. Tomorrow would bring chores and lessons, laughter and squabbles, all the mundane miracles of family life. Mason would continue healing, continue finding his voice, continue building this unexpected second chance. The silence that had been his refuge for 3 years had given way to something far more precious. The beautiful chaos of a home filled with young lives, with possibility, with future. As if in answer to his thoughts, a shooting star blazed briefly across the heavens, a fleeting moment of brilliance against the darkness. Mason smiled, remembering Elizabeth's words whenever they had witnessed such a sight. Make a wish, love, the universe is listening. For the first time in 3 years, Mason made a wish, not for what was lost, but for what had been found.